Thanks, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. And obviously I feel very privileged and honored. Katie, thank you for that introduction. I wasn't very old when I got to grips with probably a statement that worried me a great deal. When I was told by my grandfather that I was probably going to be the first generation in human history where the generation to follow me would live life less than I would. That throughout human history, the succeeding generation tended to be faster, stronger, healthier, whatever, and that we could be looking at peak longevity. What am I doing here? Oh, okay. Peak longevity, and that possibility, I was probably fiddling with it, yeah. That possibility really concerned me. And so I asked him, what can be done about it? And he was a chemistry professor. He shared a few things, but where I got to at the end of that was saying that education, access to information and the ability to make sense of it, and basic human freedoms could actually get us to a point where that was not going to be true anymore. So being brought up in a house where publishing was what we did, a magazine was what we ran, it made sense for me to do that. So everything you hear today, I hope to speak for about 35, 40 minutes and then to open up for questions. Is a personal view on this in the belief that if people have access to education, to information, and the tools to be able to do something with it, and they have freedoms to be able to enrich, play, challenge, that's going to make the difference in healthcare and nutrition and challenges that we face in energy and climate change and water, because all these things require those tools to be in place. And we can argue as much as we like. So I come to you as a passionate amateur, and the journey I'm going to take you through, I hope, shows some of that passion. Okay. Okay. I like Neil Gaiman. I dug around as one can because of that freedom, and I enjoyed that. When I ask people what a library means to them, right, all kinds of things came up, which is not necessarily what any of you may think as librarians, as people involved in information literacy, because it means many things to different people, and even what you represent may mean many things to each other. That it's a very heterogeneous mix, who you are and what you do. But in some ways, the passion for information is what brings you together. And therefore, I'm not going to be able to teach you about your individual specialisms, okay? That's not what I'm here to do. All I'm here to do is to perhaps instill some spark in you by being outside in and looking at what you do and saying thank you. First and foremost, I think it's really important for us to understand information existed before books did. Right? Books are only a technology. And we will go through more forms of technology before we're done. But what matters isn't the wrapping, isn't the delivery mechanism. And I say this to you as someone who has nearly 39,500 books at home. Okay? And these are analog books. And I am passionate not just about information, I love books. And when I retire, which I hope to do in the next 5 years or so, I know what I plan to do is to publish books. I saw a video on YouTube of two Dutch brothers, and what they decided to do with their lives was to publish books in miniature, set them by hand, cut them by hand, gold edge them, bind them, and get the leather, the blocking, everything done, have the acid-free paper, and produce 100 copies of individual books, traditionally, usually out of copyright, and then sell them for enough to keep their life going. And they actually built the world's biggest miniature book library by hand and gave it to the Dutch National Museum. And I loved it, and I want to be able to do something like that, and so I probably will. But never think of books as the end. To me, they just happen to be 500-600 years worth of technology which has evolved during that time and will continue to evolve. You know, I still listen to vinyl music. I still have a 1905 gramophone where I can listen to lacquer music. Right? Some of the things built a long time ago have lasted somewhat longer than some of the things that have come more recently. So if you start looking at sustainability, then like I was told in 1980, a paperless office is about as likely as a paperless loo. I suspect that, you know, books are going to be around for a while. They may land up being scarce in comparison to the past, right? But maybe not. Maybe self-publishing will take off differently, like 3D printing. The ideas that came through the mid-1980s of the possibility of saying, what you do with a book is you know, print on demand has for some reason become extremely cheap and tawdry, rather than saying it could have been done, to saying print on demand is you do it with such love and care that you treasure the output. It doesn't have to be someone has left his brain behind in everything to do with design in order to be able to you know, print a book on demand. Right? I've never been interested in buying a print-on-demand book because it looks so commoditized. Right? Identical looking, identical sized, you know, there is no humanity in it. So I hope it will be different. Katie mentioned that, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background as to why I talked that talk. It was mid-1980s, I went and saw a movie called Short Circuit. Okay? It was about a robot, that number 5, coming alive. And what I watched that robot do was, it went crazy about input of information. It would read encyclopedias and dictionaries in seconds flat and just say, give me input, give me input. And I sort of thought to myself, hang on a second, what if human beings are very similar to robots, except a lot more evolved, that we have only 2 types of input, energy and information. Our senses are a lot of what give us inputs, and maybe we can learn something about how we treat some of those inputs in order to understand how to treat other of those inputs. So watch that if you get the chance. The main question I pose there is, if you thought of information the way you thought of food, what would you do differently? And there are good scientific reasons to look into how humans connect up food and information in some of the ways we do. I'm not going to say any more, but Randall Munroe is a cartoonist well worth looking at. Okay. He's a real character. I've loved libraries. I've had the joy of being in places where books are collected and stored, and even today, like the child in me that loves looking out of an airplane window, it doesn't matter how many times I fly, that sort of child in me, you take me into a room full of books and I get filled with wonder. And I want to be able to pass that wonder on. And I have 3 children, nearly 15, 21 and a half, 27 and a bit. And even though they were in a house full of books, I wasn't seeing them in any way interested. And then suddenly, as time went on, the eldest became a teacher, met another teacher, and their house started filling with books. And the next one said, oh, I think I'm going to study literature at university. And he's up at York. I'm influenced by York after talking to Katie. He's at Leeds. And he's taken me to the library there, and he loves it. even goes back there during breaks because he has the access to the information he wants. And you want people to be in places where information is stored with joy, right, with happiness, rather than treat it as a place of, it doesn't need the awed reverence as much as I am in a place where I am happy. And I've been to so many of these places. I've had the privilege of having closed tours of places like the Bodleian. I've been able to touch, Gutenberg Bible. I've been able to, look at original documents in ways that I never thought I'd have the chance as I was growing up. But part of the reason I've been able to do that is because I've had this passion in me, and my father, my grandfather sort of stoked that passion up. And more than anything else, I don't care what you're interested in, what we've got to do is to get the generations coming to have that same passion, because without that, we're really going to have a challenge as human beings, because it leads to the ability to educate rather than to make everything sound bites. To have an ability to have a depth of understanding of things. It leads to the possibility that we will have common ways of engaging with each other for communities to work across culture and boundary. There are so many things that come from a real passion for information and the tools to be able to do that. One of the things I say in the TED Talk is, if you watched Fox News for 31 days, do you supersize your brain? What happens when you don't have the faculties to be able to figure out what's true or not? And those are not trivial, okay? There are a lot of people who have a lot of work to do in order to be able to figure out what's true and what's not. And the curation element of your roles and being able to train people in that, being able to advise people in that, to give them the literacy tools so that it becomes part of their role, is even more important now that everybody and everything is capable of being connected, capable of sharing information, because the ability for us to be able to fiddle with that information is high. Okay? And we're getting pretty good at it. Okay? And so you can imagine, 50 years from now, someone who's never seen the movie sort of, does a bit of a double take, but may not even recognize it, because we have got good at airbrushing, at being able to, history being written by winners, making things say what we want it to say. And the people in this room represent, one of my favorite writers on things to do with information, a guy called David Weinberger. He wrote a great book called Small Pieces Loosely Joined, about things like classification, ontology, taxonomy, particularly to do with information. And David said only a few months ago, the smartest person in the room is the room. Okay? And we have to understand what that means and how we're going to learn about collective intelligence, sharing of information, because these are not trivial issues either. Right? Collective intelligence comes through the ability to share. When I listen to music, I quite often listen on vinyl through valve amplifiers and convince myself that I'm listening to a far better quality of sound than MP3s. And I tell my son, you've got to be listening to this album on this, and he'd say, Dad, but I can't share what I'm listening to. So the idea that you may settle for a slightly lower quality of experience and augment that with the ability to share being part of the value proposition starts challenging some of the ways we may think of a lot of information we consume. Content is king used to be the way publishers spoke. But unshareable content, the reason why a Wikipedia worked, right, may not be because it was a straight head-on quality competition between Britannica and Wikipedia, but that one allowed communal interaction, one allowed sharing, one allowed audit trails to be visible and transparent. And that became part of the experience of engaging with information. So we may be changing some of the ways we engage with information, and design matters. Right? In India, if I invited friends over for a meal, some sort of magic would happen in the kitchen. Whether there was water in the dal or more rice put or whatever, but the ability to add people to a meal was simple because it was designed to scale. Right? I came to England and I did the same thing before the age of the mobile phone, and my wife sort of looks at me and when I come with 2 extra guests, says, "We're having steak." And you only have to shave off the bits of steak in order to create a new composite steak or two a couple of times before you realize you don't do it. Okay? So sharing happens by design, and even information. The way these little buttons have come along to saying file, print, send to Twitter, send to Facebook, send to LinkedIn, send to this, send to that. These things are happening because we're learning something about the flow of information and how to share it. And value comes in that sharing. There's a lot of tension that comes from it either as well, because our ability to propagate information very, very quickly can put a lot of social challenges, but actually I'm a lot less worried about privacy than other people are saying. Culturally, I was brought up in an environment where I could go to a shop at the age of 6, ask for a packet of cigarettes and get it because the shopkeeper knew me, knew my mother, knew my father, knew my grandfather, knew where I lived, knew everything about the family, and knew the packet of cigarettes was for my father. Okay? I didn't have to carry money. Communities used to know each other. And what happened was the technology of transportation at mass affordable level happened before the technology of communication got to the same level. So we had a diaspora. The communities broke up because people could travel a very long distance rather than die within 10 miles of where they were born. And now we're recreating that, which is why the Friends United or the Facebooks of this world were the first things we did. Because people do like to keep in touch with each other, but we were denied the communications ability while we had the physical mobility. Okay? No one can convince me that life got enhanced because you could live in a big city and not know your neighbors. Okay? That sort of isolation cannot be what we were actually on Earth for. But we had a mismatch because we had the physical ability to migrate before we had the logical ability to reintegrate. And now that it's come back, we are recreating many of the things we used to have as communities. But the communities can be distributed now, even globally. This is not a bad thing, because people who understand they have things in common are more likely to cope with their differences. Now, curation starts getting very, very serious. Okay? This is quite a famous picture of a guy called Alvaro Munera, who apparently gave up in the middle of one of his bullfights and said, "No more," and this is the bull coming along. Okay? Or so the story went. And then people found out, actually it wasn't Alvaro Munera at all, it was some other bullfighter. And it wasn't just as bad as that. Actually, that other bullfighter wasn't giving up either. This was a technique called desplante, where you con the bull. Okay? This is actually part of the process of bullfighting, where you sat down and say, I'm not having enough of this, and you entice the bull to come near you. So this was a lie on so many different fronts, and yet these sort of lies keep coming up because we have the tools to be able to publish. And they need, how many of you are familiar with Snopes.com? Okay? Snopes-style activity needs to be there in every one of you, and you need to instill that in every one of us so that we have an ability to test what is going on. Right? Because I've seen healthcare lies, if you think you're having a heart attack, cough, and keep coughing. And while it may be true for a small percentage of things, and this comes through as Facebook sort of memes, so lots of people are being educated at speed on crap. Okay? And the ability to know what is right and what is not, what is good and what is not, being able to give that fineness of judgment. Right? If it's not happening in the educational system alone, it may have to happen in the higher educational system. It has to be captured somewhere. Okay? Many of you are in that space, but it's not just in the space professionally. It means something about who you are as individuals in your private lives, in your social lives, because the importance of getting this right is that important for the world. Now, classification is one of the things where people don't really understand very much to do. Now, I can arrange for a copy of the slides, but this was a mid-17th century analysis of the causes of death, around both sides of the plague and the Great Fire. And the kind of terms there, one of the classifications for death was suddenly, right? One of the classifications for death was the itch, okay? And those sort of ideas to say, as we begin to learn about information, the taxonomy, the ontology, the classification processes are not trivial, but they can have a great degree of framing and anchoring of what is to follow if you don't understand both the value as well as the risk of how you catalog. Okay? In David Weinberger's book, in Small Pieces Loosely Joined, he talks about the US Library of Congress. At the time they were passing the act to saying every printed book in the US, they must have copies sent there. This was pre-Dewey. They needed a classification system. And they decided that it would make sense to start the classification process on the basis of the volume of printed books in English language emanating from a geography, and the so-called top-level domain. Because when you go to the internet and start talking about the top-level domain and battles to do with it, we've had top-level domain fights 200 years ago. But the choice they made was to take that ratio and try to equate it at the top level so that Luxembourg had the same physical value as Australasia. Okay? The land sort of west of the Bosphorus, all the way to Australia, had the same position in the classification story as Luxembourg, because at the time the act was being passed, that was the kind of ratio they had of books printed in the English language. Many, many things can get totally screwed up if we don't understand the effect of the labeling, the ontology, the taxonomy, the classification, because we start thinking about things based on that. Right? Those labels are great influences. And I don't know why in India the use of the word yesterday and the use of the word tomorrow start getting a little confusing until you realize that in Hindi, the word for yesterday is kal, and the word for tomorrow is also kal. Okay? Only context will tell you the difference in that time. But you have to start thinking about how these labels around information start influencing the ability to understand or comprehend it. Value is also something that the people in this room have to learn how to pass on the traits of. Okay? One of the great things about systems is systems have take out friction and latency in processes. So people can set up bookshops. And you can be lazy about how you price them, turning around and saying, how about if I price it at 0.89% of somebody else? And if other people start creating these sort of relationships to say, I'm not actually going to price it, I'm going to value it based on a multiple in some form or shape, or a percentage in some form or shape of somebody else's price. Well, this book, worth almost nothing, had got to $23 million before people spotted that perhaps the book wasn't worth that much. Okay? But an idea of understanding worth and value again requires an understanding of what the asset actually is. Okay? And the printed book may not be the asset. It's the ability of that book to be able to impart learning at the pace the individual is capable of handling it, with the tools and faculties to be able to know truth from falsehood. There are so many things that are going on in that kind of space. The idea that we aren't dealing with books as anything more than a technology is important, because too many people keep conflating the idea of any form of information literacy with saying it used to be books and it's now the internet. That's too facile, because the delivery mechanisms and the tools aren't actually what we are about. We have to be way beyond those. And again, when it comes to an understanding, as soon as you speak about information, it may come in many different ways. And the ability to be able to understand that in those very different ways are going to be absolutely critical to being able to provide people the ability to survive and thrive in this kind of world. But it won't happen unless they have a passion for it. I mean, I had a situation where, I thank God that my youngest, 14-year-old, was information literate. Okay, to cut a long story short, I was stuck in a situation where I had 5 members of I have an Indian passport, but my family all have British passports. And I needed them to get visas for us to go to India on Friday. And all kinds of things sort of militated together such that I only put the visa requests into the outsourced company on Monday, and I haven't actually got them back. But I knew someone who knew someone, and the power of community meant that there was someone in the High Commission who was looking out for these. And then he gave me a call and said, I'm in Milan, on business just before I'm coming here, saying, I can't do anything with your 5 because the application form numbers are no use to me to find them. And I said, well, they're the form numbers you gave me, meaning it's your system. I said, yeah, I know, but we don't use that to find it. Okay? Okay? We've got all our names and dates of birth and all that. We don't use that either. What do you use? Passport numbers. Okay? And in Milan, I didn't have the passport numbers with me. Okay? And I hadn't kept a copy either, and where were the passport numbers? Well, in the passports. Okay? And I didn't have the passports, they had them. So I couldn't figure out what I was going to do. I thought for a bit and then called my daughter and said, I'm going to ask you to do a few things, just follow exactly what I ask you to do. I said, go to my computer. I know you know my password. Okay? Get in, fire up the browser, look into the history for my visits to the Indian visa sites, just by putting in India visa, see the list, and then look at everyone until you come to a screen that looks like it was designed before you were born, with fields that said name, date of birth, application number, passport number. And then into that passport number, randomly enter 1 digit at a time to see what autofill response you get. And copy down the autofill responses, and then text me the first 5 unique 9-digit numbers you get. Okay? She did it in less than a minute and a half. Okay? Now, while this was a long story about something, the idea that the tool is only the tool, but the ability to understand what that tool is capable of doing, right, that I needed to know that I hadn't cleared the history to be able to do that since passing it. I needed to know my daughter could follow those sort of instructions, right, and that she was going to be willing and able rather than feel stressed about it. Okay? Those sort of things come through in many, many different ways and respects. Like I may be 55 years old and think that I've lived a life and learned a lot, but only this week, my mother-in-law was with us because they were traveling somewhere else and they were just passing through and stayed with us overnight, and she said something about, or her husband said something like, you've got to be very careful what you eat in Sue's house, JP. There are some things in her larder that go back to the First World War. Okay? And her immediate response was, well, just because somebody says there's a sell-by date doesn't mean it's true. And I thought to myself, is there a regulation? Where do that data come from? Are people just printing that to saying, well, I can, so obsolescence is not just built into cars and, musical instruments and phones and all that. thinking 2 years, 3 years have suddenly become a life of these tools. Maybe obsolescence is also built not by design, but by information propagation on food. And then I found a site called Eat by Date, which actually said, put in any foodstuff, and they'll tell you what the natural lifespan of it is, rather than the lifespan that unregulated food manufacturers share with you. Okay? And it never occurred to me, because I just took it as gospel, that if I saw, eat by 29 February, I'll eat it by 29 February. So that sort of education also matters. One of the most important things I think you represent as a class over here is you are advisors. Okay? People have to look to you for advice about how to do things. And that advice is there because you know things other people don't. And they know to trust you in that relationship because you haven't let them down before. And investment in the relationship, right, that people actually know your name in those sort of environments. This is a very human element of part of doing it. It can't just be done through sort of scaling out digitally. It has to be represented in a trust relationship, otherwise it doesn't work. But one of the most important things, when I speak to people who have good careers, almost everyone, without doubt, is not about his university or her university results. It appears to be that they had a good careers advisor, one teacher at their school who actually cared about where the student was going, who gave the time, who helped them fill the forms, and who talked to them. And strangely, there happens to be this sort of one teacher everywhere who's made a difference. And I take my hat off to those teachers because they have thousands of children who come out who are different because of it. Well, you also represent the ability to be that one teacher, because you're a resource in what you do, where people are going to come to you and ask, and what you say, you can either deliver it as a vanilla service, or you can realize that you have an inordinate ability to influence the generations to come. Don't misuse it. Conversations and stories have been what society has been about. People have been embedded through the narrative of stories. Right? Stories are just the DNA that carry information. And our ability to tell stories, to listen to stories, to participate in stories is what's critical. If there's anything I ever want to talk about in information, it's the fact that as society, we are actually bound together by the stories we represent, and our past represents, and our future represents. So whenever you participate in any of this, I want you to realize that if I had one word for everything that your professions, your collective professions in this environment represent, you are the future of storytelling, and you have it in your hands. Because if it doesn't happen in 50 years to come, it's because what you did and what teachers did, and the two come together, have created an environment where we thought information was a commodity. Right? Actually, it's our past, our present, and our future. It's the DNA of humanity. Accuracy is also something that matters, because today we have tools to do this thing in ways that we've never been able to do before. Right? Only two people called the American election, presidential election, correctly. One was that deep political commentator, Bob Dylan, and the other was this New York Times columnist called Nate Silver. Because rather than all the pollsters using sampling techniques and surveys and focus groups to figure out what was happening, he thought of something really unusual. He thought he'd just ask the people at the exit polls. Can you imagine something as radical as asking people what they thought, and then using what they said to formulate an opinion? What he did landed up in a situation whereby the number of states that he called right a week before the election was 50 on 50. Okay? People don't like giving credence to that, but one of the things, besides the curation, besides the ability to value information, besides the ability to separate fact from fiction, besides the ability to understand scale, one of the things that you represent is you're going to have to teach people and give people joy of understanding what being accurate means. Because in many, many parts of our lives, we've lost that ability, right? The PowerPoint generation of, you can say anything you like as long as it uses the same letter and you make 3 points or 5 points. That kind of madness has meant that we live in a world of sound bites. We live in a world of not being able to get into depth. And I don't want to turn around and say only the experts can do it. The tools that I spoke about in sharing are part of what's going to make this happen. Librarians can also get into trouble. I don't necessarily believe that this trouble was light, but apparently this was what happened in a library a few weeks ago and got the librarian sacked. And now there's a big move to saying the sacking wasn't reasonable or fair. But I don't want people to think of a library as a place where it's pin drop silence and your old nursery school teacher is back out there and nobody says a word, people only speak when they're spoken to. A library is a place where stories are generated. Information literacy is about the ability to create stories, right? To understand stories, to interpret stories is part of the skill, but the one I'm most interested in is it allows you to be the creator of stories, because our lives are our stories. I'm going to end with this. I've got other things I could talk on. When I got married, my wife and I went to Sorrento in 1984 for our honeymoon, and I met a man called Mario, and Mario took us around Pompeii, and he was fantastic. 1984 was before the web. He knew everything about everything, and we had a whale of a time. 25 years later, to celebrate our silver wedding anniversary, we took the children to the same place. We stayed in the same places and walked around the same places, and when I went to Pompeii, I was delighted to see Mario. He was 64. And I said, Mario, come, you've got to be our guide today, and he was. And taking us around, and I told him, 64, how long are you going to keep doing this? And he said, JP, I'm going back to school. I said, you're going back to school? Why? You're 64. He said, well, all the things that made me special, the internet took away. I'm going back to school so that I can be better than the internet. Okay? This was a 64-year-old. And that's what I'm going to end with. We think of the internet as nothing more than a technology. It's an ability to start moving information around. The value is not in the technology. It's in the relationships and the learning that can take place as a result. But that relationships and that learning mean nothing unless the information that is in there, it goes to people who can do something about it, learn from it, enrich it, know what's good, know what's bad, make it part of their stories and make their own stories. You in this room represent a resource that is incredibly important to make that happen. That's why I made the time here. And I hope I may have encouraged some of you in the debt that society owes you to keep doing what you're doing. Thank you. Do I stay for questions here? Or? Yeah. Okay.
Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask JP? We have roving mics, so if you'd like to put up your hands, somebody with a microphone will come and give an insight. Anybody?
I'm standing in the way of people in their packed lunch. It's a dangerous thing to do.
You might even be caking it and then you do. Any questions, anybody?
Has it been useful? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Shall
you.
we